Hey guys, welcome back to my video series where I'm going through all of the challenges in my book, The C Sharp Player's Guide, and making solutions to them live, mostly unedited. So you can kind of get a feel for just the thought process and all of that, and just see how it goes. This time we're going to be doing Simula's Soup, which this is one of those challenges that is, I mean, frankly, this was harder than I expected it to be. In fact, between fourth and fifth editions, I actually simplified it. I think in this video, we're gonna, I'll do all the stuff for fifth edition, and as long as I remember, which I no promises, I'll maybe try to do the little bit of extra stuff that fourth edition had that fifth edition removed, just in case people are here watching this and are in fourth edition. But this challenge is honestly, it's pretty complicated, and a lot of people like this is one of those that I get a lot of questions on, and people can usually get through it, but it's not without a fight. So if you're here watching this because you had a fight with this challenge and either lost or just kind of felt like, oh man, I came away with a solution, but man, that hurt. I got beat up from that one pretty good. I just want to say that's a little bit to be expected because, like I said, this challenge was for fourth edition a lot too much, and for fifth edition it's better, but it's still pretty substantial. And the reason why, like I said, I expect in future editions I'll do a little more work on this to make this a little better. But we're talking about, like, this will combine tuples, which are brand new in this chapter, with enumerations, which you just learned about in the last chapter, user input, which you've done before, but like this is just like a whole like user input, and then also with the fourth edition it included arrays. Fifth edition does not. So it's this combination of a whole lot of stuff all at once, and it's just a lot to like combine. And like I say, I think the better solution to this, and maybe if you did lose and that's how you got to this video, is you didn't feel like you knew what you're doing, and so you kind of looked for help to get through it. If that's you, then I'll make this suggestion, and then hopefully that gives you some ability to maybe give it one more try. So like I said, there's well, with this that we see in front of us, there's three parts. There's the fourth part that's the array part. So what I'm going to suggest is start really, really simple, and just basically this right here. Just make a tuple variable and make a soup, and don't worry about enumerations. Like, leave those out. Use strings for all of your types instead. Um, and don't worry about user input, and don't worry about enumerations, and don't worry about arrays. So one variable that's a tuple type, and then populate that with something that is, like this sweet chicken gumbo, like something that's like a legitimate um a legitimate soup. And then, like, this says when you're done, display the contents of the soup. So that would be part one for me, is no user input, no enumerations. It's just you make a tuple and then you just display like this. And then the second step is swap out the strings for enumerations, which is really more of an exercise in enumerations than it is in um, tuples, but it's still good practice. And that's a little, well, yeah, so you can do that and just swap it for enumeration values instead, and this part should still work. And then last, bring in the user input. And then, like I said, if you're in fourth edition and you want, like, if you're using fourth edition, just remember that I removed the part of make 3 soups. Just do 1. That's fine. You don't need to do 3. Just ditch the part with the arrays, and you will be better. Like, that's not going to hurt your learning at all, and it'll make you not, like, I don't know. Like I said, this challenge ended up being way harder than it really should have been. So don't worry about that part, the array part. Like I said, we'll probably tinker with it at the end of this, but 5th edition doesn't even have that anymore. I don't plan on adding the array part back in ever again. But yeah. So you don't need to do the array part at all. Even if you're in 4th edition and it says it, you have definitely earned your XP even without the array part. If you do everything else. So that's kind of the pathway we're going to follow here. Is we're going to start really, really simple and then add in these extra elements, which puts these objectives a little bit out of order. But yeah, so let's just get started with that. I'm going to move this off screen. I can still see it, and you guys should have access to it in your book anyway. But yeah, so let's just start really simple. And so that the first thing is what we want is a tuple, a variable whose type is a tuple. And we need, there are 3 parts to it. The seasoning, so it'll be sweet, hot, salty, or sweet. And then the main ingredient, which is, where are they? There they are: chicken, mushroom, carrots, potatoes, or the types, soup, stew, or gumbo. So we're going to just make these strings. And so to define a tuple type, you put, parentheses, and then each of your types separated by commas. And I'm just going to call this soup. So, I mean, this is the same, like structurally, this is the same thing as if we had, int soup number. Like, it's just that the type is extra complicated, right? Like there's a lot going on here. So there's all of that, and that is the equivalent of this down here. And then if we were down here, we would just say equals 1. If we want to make a new value here, it's kind of complicated, but again, we do parentheses and then we put all the values that we have. So this would be, soup. What did I use? Gumbo. Let's do gumbo. That's what the example has, gumbo. And then the main ingredient, this one uses chicken. And then the last one is the seasoning, sweet. Now, I mean, I happen to pick this order because, like, if we look over here, that was the order here: the type, the main ingredient, and the seasoning. And the output format is different. It's a sweet chicken gumbo, right? Like it's got the order different, and that, like, we could have just used this order. The order here, like, it doesn't matter what you pick. You just got to remember. And when all of our types are string, 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 it is really easy to forget what the order is. But again, this is pretty much the equivalent of this, where you have a value only. Like in this case, again, kind of like that when you make the type, you put parentheses and then you put each of the parts. So a tuple is just aggregating together multiple bits of data into a single giant chunk of data. And so that's all we've done here. Is this just combines 3 different, in this case, we're looking at strings, but it could have been an int. It could have been a bool. It could have been, 2 ints and a bool. Or we can make a tuple that has 5 parts and it's got a string, a float, 2 bools, and an int or something like that. There's no real limits to what it is. It's just this combination of stuff. And I'm going to delete this line here. I don't need that. And I'm going to do console.write line. And we're going to display the output, which we want something like sweet chicken gumbo. So this we'll display your soup is let's say you've made the, so we need, right, like we got to start here, but we need a little bit more. So we need the third part, the sweet part, which is this. And if you look in here and I just do soup dot, our options are item 1, item 2, item 3. This is item 1, this is item 2, this is item 3. So sweet plus a space plus soup.sweet chicken. So we want soup.item 2 plus a space plus soup.item 1. I'm going to run this now, and hopefully it'll say you've made the sweet chicken gumbo. Yep, there it is. Now, I think I do want to put a period at the end of that sentence. And we can use string interpolation here. I nearly always prefer string interpolation. It's just a lot shorter. and it's shorter, but also it reads better. It kind of depends, and you can use more complicated expressions in here too, which is, well, I guess you could write an expression in the plus too. That anyway, forget what I just said. You can use expressions in either place. Anyway, soup.item3, soup.item2, soup.item1, like that works. I got my period on there and using string interpolation. That's all fine and good. Those names, item 3, item 2, item 1, are thoroughly useless. And so that's the thing is, with tuples, you can give like hints about the names, but the names themselves are like, they're not really like, they're sort of ephemeral. Like, anyway, so if you want to give these parts names, so I think that's what I want to do. I'm going to use the type and what were these? Type, main ingredient, and seasoning. I think this isn't giving me any compiler errors, so it still lets me refer to them as item 1, 2, and 3. However, the IntelliSense doesn't suggest those. And actually, if you look at that, these little ... is underlining here, and it says prefer explicitly provided tuple element name. So saying don't use item 2, and since you got names, use those names. And that's what I should do, because I think that adds a lot of clarity. So if I do type, actually this, see, that's where so this is a seasoning. This is where having those names is useful. Seasoning, main ingredient, and type. So, and I'm going to run that again, and it looks like it's still working. So using these names, just like instead of having item 1, item 2, item 3, that are just like, those names are not helpful at all. And if I can see seasoning, main ingredient, type, like it makes it easier to see what's going on here. So for example, console.write line, it's super missing the soup part in there. Soup.seasoning. It's super, whatever the seasoning is. So now this will say it's super sweet. And if this had been, whatever the other choices were, spicy, it's super spicy. Like, this is a lot easier to make sure that I did the right thing compared to if this just said item, item 3. It's super soup.item 3. Like, it's just like the names make it a whole lot easier for me to just, by looking at the code, to understand what it's doing and why. So having those names is really valuable. But the names really aren't a part of the tuple. They just aren't. And an example of that would be if I do this. Oops, I need. If I do this, which will copy the whole, it's not, this is like copying all 3 of these things over when I do that. So these don't have the name. And now if I do like soup2 dot, like the item 1, item 2, item 3, they're back. So these are just like these little hints that the compiler actually like keeps those little hints in there. I'm pretty sure. I'd have to check that to be 100% sure. In fact, maybe I'll go do that. Hang on. All right, I just spent way too much time digging into that. When it's a local variable like this, the compiler ditches the names entirely. However, there are other cases where you got methods or something like that where that data makes it into the compiler, so that I guess when you're like calling the method, it is available for certain things. So these in particular do go away. The compiler ditches them as soon as it can and makes no, they're just gone after you compile. There are other places where tuple names stick around, but again, tuple element names are very ephemeral, and you can see that here. Like, we happen to have those names here and not here. Before we move on, there's one other thing I wanted to mention, and that is the capitalization of these. Local variables are usually lower camel case, so like lowercase s. If you had a multiple word thing, you would capitalize the other words, but lowercase the first one. These variables, I don't know that there is quite the same, like pretty much everybody will always do lowercase for these. Tuple names, tuples they're not that new in C# anymore, but they're newer than, I mean, they were, I don't know, C# 7 or something like that when tuples showed up in this form. And so there's less, I think, like uniformity in terms of how to capitalize these. Some people will do, the lower camel case, like main ingredient. Other people will do the upper camel case. I'm gonna stick with that because for me, when it is like you'll see as you get going, as you start making classes, most things that you call like this something dot something, with very rare exception, that next item will almost always be capitalized. It isn't 100% true, but it's pretty close. So to me, to make this part look correct, I'm capitalizing those. So that's my take on it. But if you prefer a lower camel case on it, it's fine. The reality here is once you get through the tuple stuff, then you're going to be making a lot more classes than you are tuples. And so this becomes not that big of like, you'll make classes every day that you program in C#. You will only sometimes make tuples. At least that's how most C# programmers that I know work. The tuples they're useful, they get used here and there, but you do a lot more with classes than you do with tuples. The whole purpose of talking about tuples at this point in the book is this is your first chance to see a data type that combines many other little things together of that isn't just an array of 17 of the same thing. Like these could be different things. So anyway, like I said, if you like the other capitalization on those, feel free to do that. This is the one I'm going to use though. All right. So from a perspective of just tuples, like this is, as far as this challenge goes, this entire challenge, that's the part that's like related to tuples. And if you can do that much, you're doing just fine. However, this challenge does ask you to use enumerations, and it does ask you to use user input. And the 4th edition said to do an array, to make an array of 3 of these. So we're going to do those things, at least the first 2. So we'll make an enumeration for these, and an enumeration makes more sense than a string when the choices are limited, when there's a set of specific allowed values. And in this case, the challenge describes it must be these certain things. You can imagine not every bit of text makes sense as a main ingredient. Would a main ingredient of 7B $_ be a normal main ingredient? No. You could make a giant list of all of the, from the dictionary. Here's all the food-like items that you could potentially put in here. But anyway, we're just going to use enumerations. It's nice and simple, and it's, again, good practice with enumerations. So, enum type, I'm going to call it soup type. And then our options here, the book, the description of this challenge gives us our options. So soup, stew, gumbo. And then we need an enumeration for main ingredient. And we're going to do mushrooms, chicken, carrots, potatoes, and then another enumeration for the seasoning, and this is spicy, salty, and sweet. Oh, I can get rid of this. And I'm going to get rid of that too. So now we want to use these enumerations instead. And this is going to get a little interesting. So let's do these one at a time. All right, so this, instead of using a string, we want to use this enumeration. So this will be soup type. And then we got to come over here and we've got to replace this string gumbo with soup type.gumbo. Right? And that actually shouldn't change anything. Sweet chicken gumbo, other than at this point when we're looking for options, like there's only 3 choices: stew, soup, or gumbo. So our enumeration is now doing what it's supposed to do. You've made the sweet chicken stew. Come to think of it, I've never heard anybody chicken stew. Seems like it's always like chicken stew. I wonder if there's, I'm not a chef. I don't know. Chicken stew seems like a weird thing. Whatever. Anyway, so we just got to do this with our other things. I'm thinking way too deeply about too many weird things there. What's interesting here, or even a little weird, is now I've got like the variable type is main ingredient and the name is main ingredient. And you can see like the coloration on them. It recognizes that this is going to be a type and that this is just a name. The compiler's smart enough to understand that even though the text is the same, at this point in this statement, it's expecting a type. So it knows to be looking for a type. At this point in this statement, it knows it's looking for not a type, but an identifier, a name, or maybe a comma, because we can do this, and it works. We would just have to use item 2. But it's smart enough to figure out that, oh, in this case, you mean not the type name, but the variable name, even though they're identical. If that, like, it's that kind of thing is very common, and you should get used to it, but it might take some getting used to, and that's okay. If it's bothering you, like, you can come up with slightly different names. Like, we could just call this ingredient. Oops, maybe capital ingredient. We could call it that, or we could, maybe this thing is the thing that should be called ingredient, and this thing is the part with the main. I'm going to leave it as main ingredient, but like you can kind of, like, if the duplicate names are bothering you, you could just get a little more creative with the names and don't just duplicate it. And over here we do main ingredient dot chicken. Same on this one, seasoning. When my font is as big as it is, it gets to a point where it wants to wrap around quickly. All right, so now we've upgraded everything to enumerations. You've made the salty chicken stew. I gotta say, sweet chicken gumbo sounds better to me than salty chicken stew. That I don't know. All right, so that's the first like, so now we've done tuples and we've mixed in enumerations, which, like I said, enumerations, it's not like you have to use enumerations with tuples, and it's not like you have to use tuples with enumerations. This challenge just happens to combine both of those, but at this point now we've got a version of it that has both enumerations and tuples involved, and that's fine. And again, like, we started with these being strings, but like, there's nothing invalid about having some enumerations and some of the other normal things that we've gotten used to having. In fact, like, if you look back at some of the challenges that we've had in the past, where like there was a challenge about, like, where you could, like, buy items from Tortuga's store, and there was a price associated with the name of a thing. Like that's another good example of where you might use an enumeration. Sorry, not an enumeration, a tuple to like pair up the item name with its cost. And you could just have an array of an array of tuples, or you could just have all these different tuples and just use that to pair up the name with its cost or something like that. So anytime you want to pair up multiple things, like these are things that like all belong together, a tuple's a reasonable choice for that, as is like a class or a record, which are these topics that we're getting to in the relatively near future in the coming chapters. And I usually end up using a record or a class for it rather than a tuple, but tuples are nice because you don't have to like define anything else. All those other options require doing something kind of like what we've done here with enumerations. Anyway, let's see. The last thing that the challenge asks for is to let the user pick a type. So that's going to get a little bit more complicated here. Because what we want, like everything here is working. We just, instead, like right now, these are just hard-coded values. And what we really want is the user to pick from the choices. So again, we're going to keep this as simple as possible. And we're going to worry about one of these at a time. So soup, type, tile, type equals, and I'm just baby steps here. Soup type dot stew, and then what I'll do is I'll come down here. Instead of using this like literal enumeration value, I'm going to use whatever is in this variable. So this is just going to combine the value in this variable, which happens to be stew, with this fixed value and this fixed value. And now what we can do up here is we can do something like, console.writeLine. What kind of soup do you want? And we can give them a choice: soup, stew, gumbo, right? And I'm gonna do write, so that's all on one line. And then we'll do a console.readLine. So we'll ask them and we'll give them the options, and then we'll say read in whatever they typed in. And then what we need to do is we need to convert their input into one of these legitimate types. Now, this is an area where if we were using strings instead of enumerations, we could just be done here. We could just take their input and just stick it there. And if they typed in hamburger, even though that wasn't supposed to be allowed, then we could say, you've made the sweet chicken hamburger. Why not, right? Like you could do that, but it also means that somebody could type in ASDF, and then we'll tell them, hey, you've made the sweet chicken ASDF, which doesn't necessarily make sense. So, so what we maybe want to do here is we want to map the user input into a soup type option, which again, this gets back to parsing enumeration values, and I pointed this out in the last video, this Simula's test challenge. But this blog post here, and like I said, right now it's towards the top still, but you go to the blog on the website, csharpplayer'sguide.com, and look for this parsing enumerations. This gives you a lot of information about like how to convert text into stuff. And we're going to basically do like this for now, but there are some other options farther down. And we'll just, again, switches and enumerations show up together all the time. Like that's just really, really common. So and what we'll do is we'll use this to to convert a string to an enumeration value, and then we'll assign whatever that is to this. So if they typed in soup, then we map that to soup type soup. If they typed in stew, then we map that to soup type dot stew. If they typed in gumbo, we map that to soup type dot gumbo. And now that we've got that in there, it asks us for the thing, and we'll type in stew. You've made the salty chicken stew. And run again. Gumbo, you've made the salty chicken gumbo. One more last time. Salty chicken soup. So we've done that for the type. We just need to do that for the other things as well. And there's a couple other little caveats to this that I think deserve a little more attention, but we'll come back to those in a second. What do you want for the main ingredient? And our options here are mushrooms, chicken, carrots, so we can get this and put it into, and we could maybe use the same variable. I don't know how much that's gonna hurt us to just have two. It's fine, I think. And then this won't be soup type. This will be main ingredient. And then here we'll do, we type in mushrooms. Then we do main ingredient dot mushrooms. If they type in chicken, soup type dot chicken. Oops, not soup type, main ingredient dot chicken. We do potatoes, and then down here we can do ingredient. So now we run this again, and we can do soup, and then here we can do chicken. And that blew up because whatever I typed in wasn't one of these choices. And I thought I typed in chicken, but clearly not. What did I do wrong? Oh. Okay. I did type it right. What I got wrong is I said it's not going to hurt us to do the second variable. I copied and pasted the wrong variable. So had I kept it one variable and just anyway, let's do that over again. Soup, chicken. You've made the salty chicken soup. What kind of soup do you want? Soup. So I'm going to do this, and this is going to get interesting. Mushrooms. So I'm typing in mushrooms. It's what it suggests. And now you've made the salty mushrooms soup. It's probably, since it's an adjective, it usually would be mushroom soup, salty mushroom soup, even though we had typed in mushrooms. And again, that's because of just how we displayed the output right here. Like, we're not doing anything fancy. And so it's just using whatever the enumeration option here is. So, I mean, you can go back and watch the last video about how you could like do that mapping Like we could do something here um, to convert this enumeration thing into whatever we want. Another thing we could do here that's probably pretty easy is just make all these like this mushroom, chicken, carrot, potato. And now like this output's fine. The part that's different here is this here. But like this is pretty easy. They type in mushrooms and we do main ingredient dot mushroom. They type in chicken and we use main ingredient dot chicken. So we kind of worked around it here. There are going to be places where your conversion from user input to enumeration and your conversion back, both you want like a switch to do that conversion, or it doesn't have to be a switch, but some way to like pick what you want displayed. So in this case, we managed to do it with only one switch. We went the other way in the previous challenge, and that's going to work well enough for us for now. But like I said, it sometimes that's just what you need to do is define that mapping from one set of values to another set of values with a switch or something similar to do that. And you have to map it from user input to like how you're storing it in the program, and then map it back the other way. So here, if I type in mushrooms, now it'll say the salty mushroom gumbo. Okay. So that's one problem with these. Now, one thing we haven't handled here is what happens if they just type in mushroom? Well, we blow up. I mean, we've kind of already seen that. Same with, yeah. Well, the same thing happened here too. We can deal with that in a minute. Right now, let's just handle our third little piece. Let's see if I can get it right this time. I'm sure there are at least some people out there who are saying, I almost got it wrong. I'm sure there's some people out there who are saying, why go to all this trouble of all this mapping? Why not just leave it as a string? For what you're doing in this challenge, I don't think it is the end of the world to do that. In fact, it does give you some extra flexibility, like what do you want for the seasoning? And they type in paprika, and you can work with that. You can just say we're using paprika, and you get the paprika mushroom stew or whatever. So that kind of thing like could work, but there really just are a bunch of situations where an enumeration is the right call, because it does limit you to not just any text anywhere, or any, because the other option would be to use an integer instead and say, well, 0 is sweet, 1 is spicy, 2 is salty. But it limits you down to the specific set of choices that are meant to be allowed. And I think that's like that on its own can be extremely valuable to make sure people don't accidentally use the wrong thing in there. Plus, it gives you a name to refer to that by as well. Like if these are just a string, then, and we saw this at the beginning of this tuple stuff, it just gives you a lot of room to like intermix them, and you accidentally use the soup type when you meant to be using the main ingredient or something. So having specific names for the type and for all of these options in here just makes it a lot easier to work with. So that, I think, is the main reason to do it. Yes, like if you look at how much code we had before we added in all this like conversion from the human, we have easily tripled, maybe quadrupled the amount of code. Those dang humans, if we could just get them to not be here. But that's the whole purpose of these programs is um, that's the whole purpose of these programs is for human to help the humans do something. All right, let's talk about input validation. One thing we could do here is we could do to lower. We talked about that in the last video that like now it doesn't matter whether they type all caps soup or all caps chicken or whatever. Like we handle it regardless of the user's capitalization. Now, if we want, like in these cases where we might want to support the singular version of these, because after all, that's what we end up displaying. The only thing you really can do here is you could say mushroom like you just have another option in here for it, and so you do that for carrots and potatoes. Even as I write that, like it makes my brain itch, but that's because I know more. There, so what we've at this point in the book, what we've seen in terms of switches is just really basic. Like these are all patterns. Like this is asking a question of does this thing match this pattern? And in this case, the pattern is does it look exactly like this? Is it an exact match for this? In this case, we've already dealt with the capitalization differences here by just making everything lowercase. But so we do handle different capitalizations, but we don't handle. But the pattern is it one specific value? Is it exactly a match for that? And there's a whole chapter on patterns, and it gets into a whole lot of really cool stuff. Patterns are a whole lot of fun. But like the full treatment on patterns requires knowing all about classes, which are coming like immediately after this challenge. Like your next step is going to be to start dealing with classes and objects. So, but we're not quite ready to even when we first learned about switches, like we weren't ready for all the other variations on patterns. So, but what I will say is this I'm itching to use a different a more complicated pattern. This allows this or is like a I can't remember what the name of it is off the top of my head, but it's a like a I mean it probably makes sense. It's if it's this or if it's this, then the pattern is a match and it goes on. And like I said, you can do the same thing here. Carrots or carrot potatoes or potato. And if you have, multiple other things that you want, you could put them in here. Like if you wanted to support a different language and you wanted to use the Spanish version or the German version of all of these, you could put those in. All of that's kind of overkill. And except like the other part of this is, yeah, somebody might type in carrot instead of carrots, but it's in some ways it's kind of beside the point because we still haven't handled what to do if the user types in garbage. Like, I mean, I think like literally type in what type of soup do you want? Garbage. We get this error, which I mean, the software is crashing at this point. If we just say continue, then it's over. It crashed, unhandled exception. We are in the middle of our journey about handling user input. Ideally, you would handle there'd be nothing that the user could type in here that would cause the software to crash. Like it's a really bad thing for your software to crash just because the user typed in something you weren't expecting, right? Like they shouldn't do that, but here we are. It's doing that. There are tools that are still coming that we will learn. There's a thing that we can do that will intercept this exception and handle it so that we can make sure that it doesn't, if they enter in bad data, we'll catch that and we can just deal with it and say, nope, that wasn't good enough. Try again. There is like we've seen like convert dot to int32. Convert does not have, like there isn't an option here for like convert to soup type. Like that doesn't exist. And there isn't a soup type dot. Well, actually, I say that, but I think, yeah, okay, that isn't there. Anyway, like again, I'll go back to this blog post that I wrote that actually talks about this. Like what do you do here? Well, so like one option, I'm gonna zoom in here a little bit. One option here is to just handle anything else. You just pick a type. If you can't pick a thing, then we're gonna give you a chicken. If you can't pick a thing, we're gonna give you gumbo. And that's a legitimate way to handle it. And by the way, like if you look at these switches, that's what it's complaining about here is the switch expression does not handle all possible values. Anyway, the bottom line is we're at a point where we don't necessarily have all the tools in place to totally handle all bad input. For the types of stuff we're doing, it is reasonable to just assume the user enters good data and know that if they don't, the stakes are low. Like this really is like nobody's depending on this. Like nobody's life is at stake if we get this wrong. There's not any money that's going to be lost if the software crashes. And really, like the only user of this program is going to be you. Maybe if you get on, the Discord server and share it, somebody else might run it. But like it's very limited, and the people who are doing it are programmers who, if they see the software crash, they're gonna be like, oh, I'm just gonna go run it again. Like the workaround is very simple. So we still don't have all of the tools we need for user input. We'll get there in time. So I wouldn't worry too much about like it makes sense to like handle input that you can handle. So even something like the singular mushroom, like maybe that makes sense, or this like two lower. So we're doing it like case insensitive. Those things probably, like they're probably fine to do. To the extent that we have the tools to do it, we should do it. But anything that we haven't learned about, and I've said this in a lot of these videos at this point, like don't stress over, oh no, if you do the wrong combination of stuff, this could blow up, because we just don't have all the tools yet. And that's okay. We can only have, we have to learn the tools one at a time. And right now we're picking up the tool of tuples. And in the last chapter, we picked up enumeration. So we'll get there, and it won't even be that long from now. But like I said, for right now, it's okay to just say, let's assume they'll enter pretty reasonable data. Or like I said, you could, the poor man's version of this is to just say, like I said, if you can't figure it out, we're just going to assign something. So this is enough to ensure it doesn't crash if they enter in garbage, and they'll just be surprised by what they get. Like, oh, that was what I typed in. And especially if they like accidentally typed in, they end up with like something like that. They type in STEWW on accident because they just got an extra keystroke in there or something. All of a sudden they'll get gumbo when they were almost stew. I would say it probably makes more sense to somehow catch this, recognize that we didn't get what we wanted, and ask again. That's probably a better thing. If we had done integers, like if we had said one equals soup, 2 equals stew, 3 equals gumbo, then it'd be really easy to convert the number to an integer. And then say if they typed in something else, then ask again. Like we could use a loop in that case, but even there, if they don't type in a number, with the tools we've got at this point, we're out of luck. Now, at any point here, you could jump ahead and start looking at things like exceptions and stuff like that. You could probably figure it out if you want, but I would just say it's okay. The big things are, and you could just look this up in the index, the exceptions And there's a method called try parse. So if you go looking for those in the book, you'll find all the tools that you need. But they kind of depend on a bunch of stuff that we maybe don't know yet. So one step at a time. All right. This has been almost a 50-minute. We're 50 minutes into this, and we still have more to do. But there is one thing I wanted to do, and that is this is totally a method. So let's make it a method. What I'm going to do is we're going to make a method that returns a soup type, and we're going to call it like get soup type from user. And then I'm going to copy this into here, and then I'm going to kind of hack it together. So we'll do that. We do that. And then, so we could just do, so type equals that. And then we could come down here and say return type. And then we can come up here and do type equals get soup type from user. Get rid of that. What did I do wrong? Oh, equals. And then collapse that method. And I can do the same thing down here, but before I do that, like, I just want to say that what we can do here is we can just like return that. And I've said this a bunch before. So my programming style tends to be pretty dense, and that's not just because I'm experienced. It's partly that, like, the more experience you get, the more willing you are to tolerate like dense code, because you can parse it more easily. But I just generally tend to be like, I know a lot of other programmers who aren't quite, I was gonna say, aren't quite as dense as me. Don't write quite as dense of code. So anyway, we could shorten it to that. Like I said, this is pretty compact. There's a lot going on. Like this is all one statement, and it asks the user for input. It converts it to lower, and then it does this mapping into the other thing, and it returns all that. So there's a lot going on here. Arguably too much. Like, if you want to make that argument, you are completely welcome to. And then I basically just want a method like that for all the other ones too. So we'd have ingredient get main ingredient from user. Then we're going to put all of this. So we're just shifting stuff into methods because we can. And then let's see. And then I'm going to do just a little bit of rearranging here to get these methods all together. And because it's my preference to get them at the bottom, so they got to go before the enumerations, before you define types, and now they're after. All right, yeah. So now they're just down here before we make types, but after all of our just plain old statements up here. And all right, so there we go. So now we just get the soup type from the user, which is this method, get the main ingredient, get the seasoning, and we just store all those in a variable, and then we make a tuple out of that, and then we display that. We could skip, kind of out of the frying pan into the fire. We could skip these local variables here and just put these in here. So again, like I said, my style is somewhat dense. It could be a lot worse. I don't. Anyway, I've never heard anybody say, "Oh, that is way too dense. I don't understand that." But like I said, not everybody will naturally be. Not everybody will squish that much into it. It hurts in this case a little bit that the font size is. It's usually more like that. So this doesn't like it still fits on the screen without wrapping around, but anyway. So now our main method up here is like 2 lines of code. I don't know. Having those like this, that's fine. I kind of like that better right this second. Ask me tomorrow and I might prefer it the way I just had it, where there's not these local variables. But that's what we're doing here. We get each of these from the user. They come in as strings. We got to convert them to the enumeration types, which is its own whole thing. We've put those in a method so that they're each kind of focused little chunks, which I think is good. And then we store those into their own local variables. And then we pack them all up into a single tuple, and then we display that. Now, at this point, again, you can make an argument that, like, why should I use a tuple instead of, like, why should I make a tuple? Why not just use these local variables and ditch the tuple? In this case, I'd have to agree with that. Like there's not a point in pushing them into a tuple. However, that concept of a tuple, where now I've got this variable it's got all the different parts to it, like that does make sense. And maybe that's where the array stuff that 4th edition had, which I think we're still gonna, even though this video is quite long already, I think we're still gonna go do that. Like when you gotta like hang on to that thing as a single cohesive unit, you do want tuples at that point. Because it combines all these together, and it's not just like 3 separate pieces. It's one piece all together, and you can pass it to a method or like return it from a method. Like we could right here, we could do something like get soup from user, not soup type, but get soup from user, and make another method that returns, what did we have there? Soup type main ingredient, seasoning, get soup from user, and now we can take all of this and put it here, and then we can say return type ingredient seasoning. So we return this tuple as a tuple, which I said that's very, very long like that, but that's the return type, and it's just a tuple type. You can tell it's a tuple type because it's got the parentheses, which that's not the only place parentheses are used, because here's parentheses and that's not a tuple. Here's parentheses and that is a tuple. So anyway, a little complicated, but now we can just say get soup from user and then display it. And like in this case now, to be able to, let's make sure that works before I keep going here, but you've made the spicy chicken gumbo. Okay. Yeah, so now at this point, like you can see an example of how the tuples, like the value of the tuples is like, this is just being passed around Just had a slight technical glitch. So I don't, and I mean, I probably went for 5 more minutes recording stuff, but it wasn't recording. Um, so I don't remember exactly what I was in the middle of saying, other than that I was talking about just how you can pass around. That this starts to show the benefit of using tuples over something else. You can pass around these chunks of stuff, and but where I went next with this was like I can use that as a return value, but I can also do something like display soup, and I can just pass in soup type, main ingredient, seasoning, soup, which this is like, that's a long type. Like as far as like parameters go, or variable types for like a parameter goes, like we're used to something like really simple, like int or string or something like that. In this case, this whole selected part here is the type, and it's a tuple. You can see that because of the parentheses, but it's like parentheses inside of parentheses, and then its constituent parts are a soup type, a main ingredient, and a seasoning. And now at this point, I can just put this down in here. Now I have to use item 3, item 2, item 1. And again, that's because tuple names are ephemeral. And like, if I put the names in here, now it's going to say we'll use those names instead. So anyway, the type names are not like really affixed to the tuple. They kind of, they're very ephemeral. They kind of come and go. Anyway, but like, so now I can say get a soup from a user, and I can just return the entire chunk as a single cohesive soup. And same here, I can then say, display soup, and pass in the soup. And so I'm passing like this whole chunk that's like made up of multiple constituent parts. I can pass that around, return it from a method, pass it into a method as a parameter, and everything works like you would expect it to. So that, I think, better shows the purpose of tuples versus like the example that we just had earlier, where we didn't have some of these as before we made these methods, and we were looking at, well, what if we just sidestep the tuple and just did, just use the parameters that we got out of these, the values we got out of these, and just passed them into here. So hopefully that shows a little better why you would use a tuple. And like, there's a lot of good examples of this. Like if you got a point that's like you got an X and a Y, well, those, like, they belong together. Like a blood pressure, you got a systolic and a diastolic blood pressure. Those go together. It makes sense to have, to be able to pair these things up, and or like the score, or not the score, the cost and the name of an item in the store that we did at like the Tortugas shop and things like that. So plenty of good uses where we might want to pair up a couple of numbers. We will learn about some other tools like classes and records in the future that are, I think, usually the better choice. But tuples are a nice stepping stone toward that, because it gives us, without having to do a whole lot of extra work, it allows us to start working with these things that are made up of multiple individual pieces. And that's what tuples are for. Now, I do want to visit an element of 4th edition, which is, it says make an array of 3 soups. With all the stuff that we've got here, we've got some really good building blocks that should make it really easy to make an array of these. And the trickiest part here is coming up with the type that is an array of tuples where the constituent parts are these enumerations, which is a very complicated type. Like, so if we had, an int array of 3 items, it would just be that, pretty straightforward. In our case, though, we need a tuple type. So we got something new, something, right? Like, and then in here we put what type the constituent parts are. At one point we had string. Over here it'd be new string, except for we changed that. It's no longer strings, it's soup type, main ingredient, and seasoning. We end up with something, well, like that. And like that type is really complicated, making this new array, and it's got the three, and it almost doesn't even look like an array anymore because there's just so much like clutter in there. But that's the right version to use. With one other thing that I would probably suggest here, and that is these, like, I try to avoid var, but this is such a long type name that it's a good place for var. Um, And I try to avoid var just because it isn't always obvious what the type is, and it matters in C sharp. And I don't, especially as you're first learning it, like going through the exercise of like what type does this need to be, and thinking it through and writing it out helps. It helps with the learning process. Like it makes it easier to remember. Once you get past that point and more comfortable with it, to just start using var when, especially in these cases where the type name is really big and complicated, it just makes a lot of sense. And you can see here, like I mouse over it, it's inferring the type is a tuple. It's got the parentheses. So soup type, comma, main ingredient, comma, seasoning. And it's an array. It's got the square brackets on the end. So whether you want to use var or not, like this is a more compelling case for var than, well, even than this, but especially compared to like a single number where you could type int or you could type var, whatever. So I don't need this anymore. Now I made an array. Like I said, that the hardest part of making this array is this is super complicated because it's these arrays and it's this tuple and it's all these enumerations, and um, it's it's a it's a lot. It really is a lot, and you won't usually end up with anything that complicated. But all right, if we want three soups, then what we'll do here is we'll say for. Hey, yeah, it suggested the right thing for all of that. Soups at the current index equals get soup from user, right? So we just loop through. We've got three of these, so it'll be 3 times, and we get a soup from them each time. And then once we're all done with that, and well, actually, at this point, you can just say for each var soup and soups display soup. And again, this also, what did I? Oh, it's because it's conflicting with this. Yeah. Okay. We can't use a for each loop here because we do need the index. But anyway, with these, where we're doing like this array and we've got 3 of them, hopefully that you start to see better, like, yeah, because I am like I'm moving around these soups as a cohesive unit. It isn't just a single, you know, sorry, it isn't just like 3 distinct components. We're passing around this chunk of this thing that represents a whole soup. Anyway, so now we can do this and we can make a gumbo potatoes salty. We can do a stew. So this is asking us for our second one. And there we go. You made the salty potato gumbo, the spicy carrot stew, and the sweet chicken soup. Anyway, so 4th edition needs the array. 5th edition does not need that. I intentionally took it out just because it's a lot. It's a lot of stuff to deal with all at once, and it's just not necessary. Other than, I suppose, now that I'm working through this exercise and thinking about it in this context, the main benefit that we get is that it's just, it makes it a little easier to see how we can like push around entire soups that are made up of 3 parts, and the whole soup moves together as you call this like get soup from user method and this display soup. And I think this version of the code illustrates that better than if you don't do the array stuff. but it definitely, like I said, all this stuff is quite complicated. So, okay, I think that is it for this challenge. Like I said, it's a pretty big one, and I think we've got about an hour and almost an hour and 15 minutes on it. So I apologize for it being long, but hopefully that working through all of those complexities in that order helps kind of illustrate all the different bits and pieces involved in it. And with that, I will end this video, and I will see you guys next time. Thanks for joining me.